Good evening, everybody. This is Cinnamon Noir, and welcome back to Circle of the Moon. In the last episode, we defeated the Cerberus. I managed to get our double jump, which is a wonderful upgrade to have in any Metroidvania, and made our way to this place, the Abyss Stairway, which is kind of a central hub area of the game, but it does have a boss in it. We'll be returning to the Abyss Stairway many times, and in fact, there's actually quite a bit more times that I return to the Abyss Stairway that I cut out. You may have noticed for these first couple of episodes, I'm keeping in a lot of the wandering that I'm doing, and the bumbling around not sure where to go. That's because in these early areas, there's not a lot of the map for me to ramble over looking for other stuff. And because, at the start of the game, it's nice for there to be more downtime for me to just talk general stuff. However, later on in the game, I will definitely be cutting all of that stuff out, and just going for areas when I'm making progress. I'll show when I collect some upgrades in scattered areas in the map, but I won't show getting to them. And believe me, you do not want to see that, because that's maybe already, with what I've done so far, 3 or so hours, and probably by the end of the game is going to be more like 6. That is 6 hours of gameplay that you do not need to see. So in the Abyss Stairway, we see the first appearance of these enemies, gremlins, which, these enemies that fly in and out of rooms have been very common in Castlevania games for a long time. The prototypical enemy like this, of course, is the Medusa head, which can also often turn into stone. These gremlins are a lot simpler than that. They just fly around and then, throw spears at you. So this is the audience room. Now that I think about it, this is technically where the boss is, but I really just consider this part of the Abyss Stairway. There are 3 or 4 areas in this game that are located right next to each other, and that all have the same musical track, but which have different names for some reason, and I'm not entirely sure why the game does that. Maybe to make it more realistic, like, these are supposed to be areas with different functions in the game. But of course, these rooms are so incredibly sprawling, like every single one looks like a church. I don't know why the game would bother to go for realism in terms of what the areas are called, because this castle is not even remotely realistic. It looks like it was made for a race of giants. It's like Anne Rolando. Oh, and here we find ourselves back in the place where we started the game. But the door, unfortunately, is locked, so we are not able to rescue our master, Morris, and instead we're going to have to go through the entire rest of the game, which is, believe me, a very long period of time. Shame. You'd think maybe if we just spent a few minutes working out a way to get past that door, we could do it. So that's the Triumph Hallway, another area that is basically just the Abyss Stairway, slightly different aesthetics, and it has its own name, but it's the same musical track, so it's the same thing. There's a barrier preventing us from going forward. We'll get the means to deal with that in this episode, actually. I will say, speaking of these areas all having the same musical track, I really love this musical track. It's called the Sinking Old Sanctuary, and it's actually based on a musical track from Castlevania Bloodlines, where the characters literally are going through a sanctuary in Greece that is sinking into the ocean. It's like a sunken Greek temple. Really cool area, and of course it has a great musical track, which I really like this game's arrangement of it too. Maybe it's not quite as good as the original, which could use the Genesis sound chip. Much better than the Game Boy Advances. But still, I really like the way that this game arranges it. And it's very energetic, just like the first theme, Awake. So we pick up the axe here instead of the holy water, and I decided to keep it because the axe is actually pretty useful for this next boss. It's not immediately apparent, but that little puddle enemy actually can give us poison, which in this game, as in most games, poison just causes your health to steadily deplete. It's not quite as annoying actually as poison in Aria of Sorrow, but it's still pretty annoying, especially when you consider that in this game, healing, damage that you receive is much harder. Another strange thing which I've noticed, and this game is full of little quirks. I guess that's part of the reason I decided to play through this again anyway. I just had Nathan pound the ground a little here, out of frustration. That little animation I love, because it does look like he's just mad and pounding the ground. But, yeah, one weird thing that you may have noticed is that when Nathan took damage from the axe armor, he turned green. Nathan will turn colors like that when he receives damage, but you would think turning green is an indication of, getting poisoned. It's another thing we see again here. But he doesn't. That's literally just a stylistic thing. And when you do get poisoned, as far as I can tell, there is no visual indication of that, which is very strange. You'll just notice, I guess maybe he'll flash purple, and then you see your health ticking down, which is what tells you that you're poisoned. But one funny thing about this game is it is very subtle about a lot of different things. Some of the effects that the DSS spells have, for instance, are things that the game doesn't outright tell you until you've used it for a while. And often you'll only notice a buff, for instance, by using the DSS spell and then looking at your select screen and noticing that one of your stats has gone way up. And that tells you, what the magical spell has increased in terms of your stats. I used to really dislike axe armors in this game because they are pretty intimidating at this stage, but the more I've the more I play the game, the more I come to like these guys. They're actually a pretty nice test, and one very useful thing they tell you is that in this game, enemies will often have quite a wind-up before they start attacking. Like when you enter the room, you'll have 2 or 3 seconds before they actually start with their attacks. And that's a very useful time period. If you can take advantage of it, you can, wipe through enemies. You can just wipe them out before they even get a chance to attack. So this game is kind of balanced in that way, that even though, health hits are quasi-permanent because there's no potions and no shops. I shouldn't say no potions, there are potions, but they're useless. The benefit of that, the upside, is that it is actually fairly easy to take out a lot of enemies in this game without taking any damage at all. The hardest thing is dealing with enemies that can fly all around the screen or send out projectiles, who will often damage you without you even realizing that they are in the room. One other thing you might want to consider, even though it might be obvious, is that to deal with those puddle enemies, I am crouching down on the ground. That will cause you to be able to hit enemies you can't hit from a normal standing position. Your posture in this game is actually kind of important. There's lots of enemies with unusual hitboxes. I won't say bad hitboxes. They're fair and they're interesting. They're just not, normal. Because there are enemies with a lot of weird shapes in this game. There is a box. Pushing that box is actually one of the upgrades we'll get, and we will not be getting it for a long time. Longer, oddly, than we'll be waiting to be able to destroy those cracked blocks, which is funny, because the cracked blocks look a lot heavier than those boxes. That just looks like a normal wooden box. You would think a guy who's as physically fit as Nathan could just push it ordinarily. He wouldn't need some magical amulet to do so. But, it's one of the funny things about this game. Your character will be able to leap off of walls and, destroy boulders before they're able to move a box around. Metroidvanias often have quirks like that. I will say, in terms of the upgrades you get in this game, this is one of the quirkier Metroidvanias I've played. So, lots of Metroidvanias, you'll get the double jump somewhere between a third and a halfway through. Dashing is often something that's fairly early, but not the first thing you get in the game. The idea of being able to dash and double jump, when we've really only played about 10 to 15% of the game so far, maybe even less than that, is pretty unusual. And it's one of the things that makes this game special. This game, oddly enough, visually and audially, I suppose, it's not that distinct from other Metroidvanias, but in terms of its structure, this game's actually very distinct from other Metroidvanias. And by that I mean other games in the Castlevania series, as well as just the genre generally. So this is one of the castle's battlements. There's quite a few rooms like this. We won't be getting up here until we get another upgrade. And actually, once we get that upgrade, we'll actually be heading down this room, not up it. But we'll see that later on. Not a lot to do here. I was testing around for, breakable walls, because I am always doing that, because the game encourages you to. This game will kind of affect your psychology, or at least it does to me. This game makes me a total pack rat. It makes me want to grind, against enemies that give me useful stuff and just hoard them. And then also, it makes me into a coward, in that I'm constantly going back to save, because the game hits you so hard, it just kind of makes you paranoid. And then I would say the game also makes you like someone who obsessively searches walls. It just turns you into that kind of person. I guess it's true what they say about games having a negative effect on people's psyche. But you can see what I was talking about earlier with these axe armors. They're actually not that hard to dodge. Or, get hits on. They're just kind of intimidating. They're like the knights in a lot of Dark Souls games. You have to learn their pattern, and once you do, they're actually one of the easier, Mook-type enemies. Much harder in this area, which we saw a little earlier, are those electro-skeletons, who zoop back and forth across the landscape very quickly, and can send out an electrical bolt, which will crawl across most of the floor and can hit you from almost anywhere in the room. Which is pretty irritating. Those electric skeletons remain a nuisance for quite a bit in this game. Here's one of them. Luckily, I get rid of him quickly. You learn to do that after playing this game for a little while. So we're going to be heading up, actually, along the castle walls pretty soon here. I've been fooling around looking for upgrades and just kind of retracing my steps. But progress here actually is from going up in this room we were just in. We will be going all the way onto the roof of the castle. And fight a very unusual enemy there. But that's to come. It is kind of interesting how easy the skeleton soldiers are in this game. I'm used to Aria of Sorrow, where the soldier-type enemies are actually pretty intimidating. But not here. So here we go. This main hallway, which has these 3, electroskeletons, can be pretty annoying. And you have to traverse it a lot if you're backtracking through various stuff. Oh, wait, sorry, I'm wrong. This is not the hallway I was thinking of. Oh, blocked off again. So the game is inexorably leading us up, which is the only direction which leads to progress at this point. Admittedly, when I said earlier that Symphony of the Night was not like this, that it was more open, it becomes like that later on. Symphony of the Night in its early stages is just as linear as this game is. Although I will say it's blocked off less by there being a lot of areas where you could get to different places with upgrades, and more that it's just early on in Symphony of the Night structured in such a way that you're only able to go in one direction from where you are. There's not many, in the Alchemy Laboratory, there's not actually a lot of connection points to other places. So here we are out in the castle battlements, lots of skeleton bombers here, which at this point have already become a real chump enemy. Like, they're not very intimidating at this point. One thing, though, and the reason why they're here, is that their bombs will stagger you and cause you to be hit back, which means that since there's some kind of precision jumping required here, they can knock you off and make you go back to the beginning and do it all over again, which is kind of frustrating. Like so. Although in that case I kind of screwed myself. Luckily this is the first part, so I can actually just jump back up. It's surprising early on how many areas there are where you're blocked off just by not being able to jump quite high enough, and so you need other power-ups in order to make up for that. But the game doesn't, block you off using these obvious, sheer walls. Instead, it'll just be a jump where it kind of looks like you could make it. There's one particularly frustrating area like that. That's going to be in the next episode. But another thing we see here on the castle walls are these very disturbing enemies called brain floats, which are basically brains with a single eyeball and a brainstem just floating down from below them. That they float around and they can shoot little electric balls at you. Very strange. Later on, we'll learn to use those guys to our advantage, because they often come in these columns of enemies that are very tall. And when you get a certain DSS power-up, you can actually freeze them, which allows you to jump from enemy to enemy, kind of like the Ice Beam in Metroid. Actually, now that I think about it, exactly like the Ice Beam from Metroid. And that will get you to some new power-ups. And believe me, as soon as we find that DSS combo, I will be going back to get those upgrades, because, like I said, this game turned me into a chicken. Not to mention, when I get it, that'll be right before the most obnoxious boss in the game. So I will need those power-ups. So here on the other side, we find another save point, which comes very much in handy. Glad to see it. I come back to the save point an awful lot because it's right next to a warp room, actually, which I think we might be just about to find. So obviously, since this game isn't an RPG, you do collect experience and you do level up. Leveling up's probably the most important thing in terms of, doing more damage against the enemies and having an easier time. But there's also some equipment you can get that's very useful for that. And here's the warp point. I actually really like the way warp points are structured in this game. It's a lot more subtle and kind of metaphorical in this game. In Harmony of Dissonance, which is very similar to the save points from Symphony of the Night, it's this big pentagram-looking thing that turns into a coffin, very stylish and kind of goofy. And then in Aria of Sorrow, the warp points are that weird demon face. But here it's just an open doorway with an arch over it, which to me is much more evocative. I actually really like the aesthetics of the warp rooms in this game. It's a shame there's so few of them, so that I find warp rooms more of an annoyance in this game than a pleasure to run across. I really do think this game, despite the fact that there are reasons for it being as tough as it is, it could have stood to be a little more lenient. It's so tough that this game turned me off a little bit when I first played it, and it took me a while to actually get into the groove of it enough that I didn't just hate it and want to stop playing. Part of that is just learning the combat, obviously. So here we come to an area that is not given a different name. Presumably this is still part of the audience room, which I wouldn't say this entirely looks like an audience room, but and nevertheless, aesthetically, this area is rather different from the first part of the audience room. We can see the moon through all of these arches in the background. And there's also these weird little faces called devil towers. I think those enemies first appeared in Castlevania Bloodlines, which would kind of make sense since this has a track based on Bloodlines. But I'm not 100% sure. This is the only game that I've played where I see these guys. They're kind of cool. I like their limited animation where they rotate around on the pillar. It does give the world kind of a stronger sense that it is three-dimensional, which isn't particularly strong in this game, but admittedly, that's a fault that's shared by all three of the GBA Metroidvanias. And didn't really get improved on that much until, I would say, Order of Ecclesia, which did a fairly good job of convincingly portraying a 3D setting in a 2D, graphical world. I really love Order of Ecclesia. I talk about it too much, but part of the reason that I often make derogatory comparisons between other Metroidvanias and Order of Ecclesia is just that I really, I really get a kick out of it. But like I said in the video about, the scariness of Castlevania, each one of the 6 games that I covered in that video has its own kind of appeal. And I really do think that none of them is a bad game. If anything, this might actually be the worst of the lot just because it's so hard that limits its appeal. But it's that same difficulty that actually gives it an appeal the other Castlevania games don't have. It makes it special. I honestly think that if you like the older Castlevania games with their, insistence on getting good at the combat mechanics and relative lack of cheap, cheesing options, I do think that you'll probably enjoy this even if you don't enjoy the other Metroidvanias, because it's just so much like that. This is also a game where you can't just use potions and stuff to cheese boss encounters, because you don't get them. The game doesn't let you buy them, and you would have to probably spend 4 or 5 hours farming skeletons, at least if you don't have the luck boost, which I'll show off a little later. But you'd probably have to spend 4 or 5 hours in order to get enough potions to even heal your bar, a couple of times, which would be the equivalent of a full Estus flask in Dark Souls, and you get that for free. You don't have to do any grinding at all. Am I saying that this game is harder than Dark Souls? Yes. No, not really. Obviously, Dark Souls is harder in terms of the actual combat. In this game, combat is fairly simple, and, you can get a grip on it. I have often thought, and I think I even mentioned in one of my videos, that 2D combat is inherently easier than 3D combat because your brain has less to process. You can see all of the stuff that's coming at you at any given time. There's no camera to orient or anything like that. And so it's kind of a simpler mental problem for your brain to solve. And I think as a result of that, even games like this that are very brutal and unforgiving are still easier than a game like Dark Souls, which is just 3D combat and is more forgiving. But I still take some pretty brutal punishment in this game. And I will let you know in advance, this is not a no-death playthrough. I did die a couple of times in this game. Not, admittedly, until I got to the most annoying boss I've ever fought. In almost any game. But it happens. We are going to see the game over screen. I mean, at this point, with Arya and me dying to death, it's kind of a tradition, right? If I ever play Harmony of Dissonance, I'm probably going to have to die in that one too. Even though it is much harder to die in that game. In some cases, you would actually have to try in order to lose your life in that game. So this is sort of the central area of the audience room. I really like this area, just this giant room with this central, spiral element to it. It's evocative, if nothing else. It has a little bit of that quality that Harmony of Dissonance has, where the space feels fuller than it is because of the level of aesthetic detail. I will also say, when we get to the chapel area, that area is pretty fantastic. There's some really great graphical details in this game. It's just that overall, the graphical fidelity is so low that it's kind of hard to appreciate them. But if you're a fan of the older Castlevania games, I think you're kind of used to that aesthetic of simple details that a lot of those games have, and I think that could help you appreciate this game a little more. It's very different from the more anime-inspired style they went with on the DS. And honestly, also, I have to say, while Ayami Kojima may have been involved in the creation of the characters and backgrounds for this game, her style is much less apparent in this than it was in Symphony of the Night, or than it later would be in Harmony of Dissonance and Aria of Sorrow. This game feels much more like a straight-ahead European fantasy. There's relatively little of her kind of aesthetic, watercolor-y design to it. This game is more just barbaric, which is kind of cool. It makes it different. So that's a boss door. We'll be heading to a boss pretty soon. Oh, and you know what? I had forgotten that the Devil Towers can also leave behind potions. So if you want to, throw caution to the wind and try to grind for potions in this game, it might actually be better to grind for them here, where there's lots of Devil Towers and they're really easy to kill, than to do it with the skeletons. Fun fact. If only I'd known that earlier. In fact, if only I'd done blank earlier is going to be kind of a theme of this game, as we'll see in subsequent episodes. So the second boss, the Necromancer, oddly enough, has more lines than almost anyone else in this game. He may actually have more lines than Camilla, which is weird. This is a character that is not introduced at the beginning. Like, God knows who he actually is, and yet he's like the puppet master. He's like, yes, let me tell you exactly what our evil plan is, down to the smallest detail. He is also a pretty difficult boss fight. In what will soon become a tradition with this game. Pretty much every boss fight is difficult, and everyone manages to get me down to a sliver of health. So the least frustrating thing this guy does, it's really just more of a distraction than anything else, is he'll send out a bunch of beams that will summon various enemies into the room. And you'll have to deal with them, right? You can run into them and they'll do damage. One thing about it, though, is there's really not much to worry about with these enemies, because he can only summon zombies and skeletons. They do about 1 damage by bumping into you, meaning that the worst that can happen is temporary irritation. Whereas his attacks do like 20 to 30 damage each. I guess in this case it's 14. Not that much, but it's still a lot more than 1. So if you can dodge a single one of these circular things, that means more than running into a whole room full of skeletons. So why would you worry too much about this aspect of his attacks? So I defeated him here, and forgot that he had a second phase, which temporarily really threw me. Like, and I think you can see why, right? Who would remember that this boss has 2 phases? It's the second boss in the game, for Christ's sake. Oh, he also has this move in his second phase, which I really hate. Literally just randomly flies across the room. He's completely invulnerable during this phase. The thing this boss does that I really hate and that I consider very cheap is just how often this guy is not vulnerable to damage. The thing with him is not so much that he's like really hard or that his attacks do so much, but more just that he spends so much time just cheaply... Like, look at this. He's off the frickin' screen. Why is he even able to go there? I don't think that's fair. A lot of enemies in this game can do that, and it just kind of feels like you're cheating. Like, the game is cheating in the boss's favor. It often feels that way. It's just a very strange situation to be put in. I do manage to defeat him with more health left than I had with Cerberus. But, you know, part of that is because I had a potion in this fight. You may have noticed, though, when I use the potion, it's 20 HP. It means almost nothing. One interesting aspect of this fight with the Necromancer's, super long narration is that because of it, Nathan now does know that Morris is still alive, which I suppose is a blessing. And he'll be alive, I think, until the moon rises. Oh, don't mind that. That's just my potato of a computer cracking up because the achievement didn't pop up for defeating the Necromancer. There's probably a way to turn off those achievements, and I probably should because I don't like them at all, but oh well. Here's me temporarily forgetting where the save room is. Not useful at this point. Here's me getting hit by an electric skeleton, which I did not need. That almost gave me a heart attack after that really hard boss fight. But thankfully we were able to save. And our troubles are over for now. So, thanks for watching, everybody, and I will see you next episode. Let's just groove out here with Nathan for a little bit.